This is episode 90 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week, we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Well, Wally, another week and another installment of our Facebook in New Mexico saga. And this one is perhaps the most bizarre installment yet. Kind of setting the table for you, Wally, here is politicians of both parties had been complaining about the PRC's decision to make Facebook pay $39 million for a new transmission line. The PRC said this line is by and large going to benefit Facebook. The politicians and Republican, Democrat legislators, the governor, pretty bipartisan alignment on this. We're saying, heck no, the PRC is crazy. They are anti-business, this, that, and the other. I'm not going to say the PRC is or is not anti-business. I'd say they're generally anti-business, but they're no more anti-business than the legislature or the governor. So to throw the PRC out under the bus seemed a little bit odd to me, especially when we're talking about $39 million that ultimately is going to fall on the backs of who else but you and I and the rest of the ratepayers here in New Mexico. Well, now we have a Sunday paper, Ron Darnell, Senior Vice President of Public Policy at PNM, big mea culpa in the opinion pages of the paper, saying that PNM presented an incomplete case for the power line. And long and short of it is, yes, they believe that Facebook is right, or Facebook should not have to pay the $39 million. They don't throw the PRC under the bus. Maybe that's because they're regulated by them. But generally speaking, this looks like oops, PNM screwed up. We did not do a good job of explaining to the PRC what was happening here with these transmission lines. Wally, I know you do a lot with utilities and you've done a lot with PNM. Tell us a little bit about your perspective on this ongoing saga.
Well, let's go ahead and let's just for a minute accept at face value what Senior Vice President Ron Darnell said, that they put on a bad case. That would not be the first time a utility put on a bad case in a matter like this. The other thing that happens in rate cases, or regulatory proceedings, it's very technical, and how questions are asked and answered. It's administrative law, but it has a lot of which has a lot of, any kind of court proceeding overtones. And, who knows, maybe they answered a question slightly imperfectly that led the commission to believe this. But when you say, well, will this benefit Facebook? Somebody might have said primarily, there's lots of words that could have colored that led them to that decision. The other issue is that in the short term, maybe it does just benefit Facebook. That's a very distinct possibility, but that doesn't mean that facility wouldn't have uses above and beyond and being part of their long-term plans. So who knows? You cannot tell from this what they did, but it's interesting that another hearing will be commenced if PNM and the governor get their way, and maybe a different outcome will come from this, because there's a lot of people in New Mexico have made a lot of political points promising things to Facebook that they want to have go forward. The other thing that I'm still not willing to let drop is that there is a lot of frustration amongst regulators at the PRC that I have been hearing about with what happened with the Energy Transition Act. And so they might have gone out of their way to take a particularly harsh look at this relative to what the politicians are doing. And I've heard regulators that have expressed frustration that they were bypassed by the Energy Transition Act. Does that have anything to do with this? I don't know, but there is a heightened sense of importance with all of this, and this is one of those that we'll look back. Maybe we'll know the story, maybe we'll don't. But they're seeking a do-over, and will they get a different result the second time? We'll have to wait and see. The saga continues.
Yeah, and a couple choice quotes from Mr. Darnell. Now, again, utility regulation is a complicated business. He claims in this article that the new transmission lines will save our customers, that's PNM, $21.5 million in system costs while delivering more reliability. Now, I don't pretend to understand how spending this amount of money on a new transmission line will save $21.5 million in system costs, whatever those are. And by the way, is this an annual number? Is this a one-time number? So if you're spending $39 million to save $21 million, you're still coming out on the short end of that. And lastly, he talks a lot about renewables and how this line is important to join PNM's eastern transmission, wind generation, of course, coming out of the eastern prairies, with the rest of the PNM system. So would this be the early kind of start of expenses bearing down on ratepayers to PNM for things like the Energy Transition Act? Of course, the Energy Transition Act really doesn't start to kick in until next year. However, we are heading towards 20% by 2020, and PNM is still implementing that renewable mandate passed under then Governor Bill Richardson. So we're going to certainly find out more. I suspect that Facebook will ultimately get their way, since the main players here, Facebook, of course, the PNM, both of those two are seemingly in agreement, along with the political leaders of the state of both parties, on behalf of Facebook and its plans to not pay $39 million to the state of New Mexico. So we shall see.
Well, and one thing that is clear in the Energy Transition Act marketing, if you will, or how that was sold to legislators and sold to the public, and this op-ed by PNM continues that, is they talk a lot about it would save these dollars. But as you pointed out, is that annual? Is that one time? And save them from what? You know, it's like we are missing part of the mathematical equation. So it's like, if it would have cost this, but now it's going to be 21 million less. That's the part that is a little bit disconcerting because of the economics. And then take that along with the fact that PNM has said they can be carbon-free 5 years sooner than the Energy Transition Act. It's like, I don't know, it's starting to remind me a little bit of Austin Powers. We're going to save $1 million. And it's like, really, compared to what? And is that a big number, isn't it? You know, there's big numbers involved in utility. There's some math to be done on these things.
Yeah, and kind of to take the discussion home, you expect that a utility and a major international company, when they are discussing things, at least internally, one would hope that they are explicitly discussing $21 million out of X, Y, and Z, and who's going to pay for what, and let's dot the I's, cross the T's, and make sure this is all defensible in the court of law, the court of public opinion, before the PRC, all those kinds of discussions you think these guys are competent with. But I think sometimes, much like the Wizard of Oz, you get to the end of the yellow brick road and you realize that the wizard is just a man behind a curtain pulling a bunch of levers and trying to be more than he really or she really is. And unfortunately, sometimes I think we may have been given a glimpse behind the curtain there, Wally.
Okay, no doubt. And I appreciate the Wizard of Oz reference along with Austin Powers. I think that encapsulates it right there.
There you go. Well, speaking of organizations out making a case, this is a different issue. Of course, Right to Work, Rio Grande Foundation. We land in the Albuquerque Journal and a lot of New Mexico media outlets on a pretty regular basis, but made our way into the national Capitol Hill-oriented publication, The Hill. It is geared towards, I remember in my time as a staffer on Capitol Hill, that's one of those publications right there with roll call that would show up in congressional offices. I suspect that the Hill is branching out, now in the days of online media, that they tend to cover a little broader political spectrum, not just geared towards the Hill itself. But I wrote a piece in which I discussed New Mexico legislatures, Michelle Lujan Grisham's, and then the state of Illinois, their legislature and governor as well, prohibiting local right to work efforts and kind of that ongoing conflict that you get between state governments and state government officials and local governments and their efforts to break free in the case of right to work from stifling policies imposed by Santa Fe. Of course, no principles here were harmed. The principles of whether states should control labor policy, like minimum wage, or other policies like mandatory paid sick leave, that is up to the discretion of local governments in New Mexico simply because it fits the ideology of the legislature and the governor. So wanted to bring this to a broader national audience. And having done this now at the Rio Grande Foundation, trying to work on New Mexico policy issues, unfortunately, lots of people around the country, hate to say it, but they really do not know that New Mexico is a part of the country. There's an element out there that is pretty uneducated about geography in the state. But more importantly, even among people who are fairly in tune with public policy and geography, they don't really think about what is going on in New Mexico. We're not a bellwether state in terms of public policy issues. So it's very difficult to get attention from national media outlets, Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, any of those guys and gals, New York Times, et cetera, unless there's an issue that comes out that fits kind of their agenda and their reporting angles that they have in existence. So thanks to The Hill for running our article, and hopefully we got a lot of interest there. I saw the comments number was ranging over 700 last I checked. So a lot of comments on the story implying some level of engagement. But anytime you throw right to work out there with the unions, that's just asking for a whole boatload of comments to come in.
Well, Paul, when you sent, I clicked on the link, things you're going to talk about, and I actually paged down too quickly before I saw who wrote the article. And so I was reading, it's like, wow, The Hill ran this? And then it went to the top. It's like, oh, The Hill ran something from Paul Gessing. Good job. The other point that you alluded to is the comments that you read the comments and, the whole role of unions, past, present, and future. Many of the points that are made in the comments seem to be very relevant. If maybe for the 1850s, but not necessarily for 1920. There's a lot of things have happened in our country in the history of union membership, and when unions were at their peak from a potential adding value point of view, there were not things like OSHA and MSHA and other things like that. But it is interesting, and you're right. You have definitely struck a nerve, and people are continue to type away and comment on your piece, and it's a good one.
Yeah, it's one of those things about submitting articles like that. You write something in the Albuquerque Journal, and maybe one every 2 times, depending on what you're writing about, somebody reaches out to you. And of course, people kind of know who I am at this point. people who read the paper. And I know that's a relatively small and select group these days, but honestly, folks, if you're getting your news from cable television, no matter what station it is, you're not getting a very good representation. You got to read your articles, and preferably a local newspaper or two will help you get more informed on whatever issue you're looking at. Of course, listening to the Tipping Point New Mexico podcast will make you automatically among the top 0.05% of informed citizens in the state of New Mexico. However, I suspect that people who listen to this podcast also tend to get their news from various written outlets, either online or in a paper, plain dead tree format. So either way. But we got more on labor law and the issues surrounding kind of right to work in a general context. Polling came out this week, and some polling is more relevant than other kinds of polling. You hear people say, well, global warming is a huge issue, or global warming is not a big issue. Whatever issue you're talking about in the poll, it can be managed in terms of the language that they actually ask people to get the result that you want. But in this case, a group did some polling of just teachers, so focused polling on teachers and what they actually believe about negotiating salary and benefits. Now, this is unique because when you actually ask people what they want in their profession, it is more relevant to them, and the trade-offs are relevant to them in ways that abstract public policy issues are not always. And teacherfreedom.org is the organization. So they are ideologically pro-freedom, but the survey was very basic and simple, and they found that 35% of teachers would prefer to negotiate salary and benefits for themselves. There's no real way to mislead people or push poll them on that kind of issue. That number rises to 48%, by the way, for teachers under 35. So younger people are more confident in their ability and desire to negotiate salary and benefits for themselves. 35% of teachers would like the option of a 401k. Of course, teachers, as in most government workers, are often put into pension programs that require many years of work in that field, and then you eventually vest and get a very, very generous pension at the tail end. But in today's workforce, most people don't work long enough to, the average person, I should say, does not work long enough to get that pension. And perhaps they don't want to be a teacher their entire life in order to get that pension. And 41% is the number of teachers under the age 35 that would like a 401k. So a lot of interesting results, but right to work was enshrined for government employees, including teachers, in the Janus versus AFSCME U.S. Supreme Court decision. The union said, well, now they're free riders. Now we have to negotiate for them, even though they're not paying any dues to us, which is accurate, except for unions have lobbied very long and very hard to keep people like teachers who don't necessarily want to be a part of the union or pay their dues. They've been able to keep those people in bargaining units that then allow them, the unions, to negotiate on behalf of people who want nothing to do with the union. So it shows that increasing numbers and a large percentage in general actually want to do this for themselves and don't feel the union is a good intermediary or a valuable intermediary, no matter what their position is on unions. So, Wally, some interesting stuff there, and I think it's good for the future of movements towards increasing worker freedom beyond just the Janus versus AFSCME decision.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you start to talk about the issue of free riders. It almost requires a value judgment above and beyond, or a philosophical or a political judgment that things are supposed to be this way. And, that free rider argument, the unions make that like crazy. They don't talk about the forced rider argument, which is that you are forced to get something that you don't want. And so this really brings that into play. And it's a very interesting development. It's clear that education in the United States, a little bit of innovation and some flexibility might be in order. And I think that would tend to be well aligned with teachers having more of this flexibility. And we'll see how it all plays out. But that whole free rider argument, every time I hear it, it just makes me cry crocodile tears, because they never do talk about the other side, about who is being forced to receive something that they don't want. And this poll brings it out that maybe there's a pretty large percentage of teachers that are in that category.
Yeah, Wally, you missed it. I was up on your roof repairing and laying some. What do they do for flat roofs? Tarring the roof
or
there?
Rolled roofing.
Yeah, so you can make the check payable to Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation. And, if you don't pay my check, you are a free rider, sir.
But Paul, I didn't want a new roof.
Hey, that's irrelevant to the discussion. According to the union logic, you have to pay me.
All right.
So pay up. All right. Enough of that. Should we have even more people on our city council in the city of Albuquerque? This is one of those policy ideas that only the progressive left wackadoodles can cook up. And, look, there is an argument to be had that whether it's Congress, which has been at 435 for, I know, several decades, all of my lifetime, as the population in the U.S. has risen dramatically, and Isaac Benton, city councilor, and generally wrong on everything, has put forth in legislation, not just as an idea, that he wants to put Albuquerque City Council from 9 to 11 members, could go to voters as soon as November the 5th, the next election. As he says, since 1974, I guess that's when the city went to 9 councilors. The population went from 260,000 to now 585,000. So we need, by that logic, somehow we need 2. I don't know. We maybe should double the size of city council. We should go to 18 councilors, or maybe just keep it an even 17, so that we have an odd number in case there's a tie vote. Regardless, I can think of many flaws in the argument, many reasons not to increase the size of city council. But Wally, I'd like to hear your perspective on this one.
Well, I will say that I made it way further in this op-ed from Councilor Benton than I ever have before I shook my head and thought that, no, this is not right. And there is some argument to be made for this. If you look around, a place like Chicago would have 50 aldermen. Albuquerque has 9, Councilor Benton proposing it to go to 11. What happens as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, though, is that then a lot more work has to be done in committees because, 11 people, as you add each person, it gets harder and harder to do that on the Monday night city council meeting to make policy. So is it a bad thing? I think he lays out a well-reasoned argument for it. Is it dramatically needed in the city of Albuquerque? I certainly don't think that. And if it were to also get on the bandwagon of we're going to grow from 9 to 11 to 13 to 15 to 20 to 30 to 50 and turn the city council of Albuquerque into this massive legislative body that has to have all these committees, it just makes it that much further. That committee system and dispersing it makes governance from a citizen point of view much more out of reach. So now you can go on Monday and get most of the story, not all of the story. A lot of it happens in planning and zoning commissions and other places. But as you add more and more, I think it puts checks on the government from the citizenry out of reach. And for that reason, I think it's not necessarily a good idea. I would say I'm against it, although 9 to 11 is probably not a huge difference. But man, I don't think you'd want to go much more than that, because a deliberative group with 20, 30, 40, 50 people having to all get their say in on something is very cumbersome. And you think city council meetings are bad now to go to, and they are. Man, wait until there were 30 or 50 people. 11, maybe not so bad.
No, and I agree. That is the bright lining or silver lining here of Benton's proposal, is only going from 9 to 11. But yeah, it is a flaw inherent in democracy. It's the reason the founding fathers were not fans of democracy. No amount of people on a city council or in a government structure as elected officials will truly represent what I believe, what you believe, or what other people in our community believe. What we need is a city council that has a grasp on what it can and what it cannot do, or what it should not do, not bringing more people into the city council to represent even more special interest groups and push their causes in city government. Chicago is a perfect example. Yeah, they have a mini Congress up there and with their aldermen and the complexity of running Chicago government. Now, there's no number of city councilors or aldermen in Chicago that could make Chicago government function anything more effectively than it is now. It's a matter of what those people believe. So when you're named as one of the top dangerous cities of America, and crime rates and property crimes and all the things that have been coming down on Albuquerque's head, and you're out there pushing for plastic bag bans and the various harebrained priorities that this city council has, that is your problem, not adding 2 more people to vote for a plastic bag ban on city council. It's just solving the wrong problem from the wrong direction. And it's not, again, not a huge deal, but why just 11? I mean, we are up, as the good counselor said, since 1974, directly quoting, we had 260,000 people in the city. Why going to 585,000? Are we just going to add 2? I can just imagine the amendment now. Well, we should be going to a 17 or a 19 member council. Will a 19 or 17 member council do any more effective of a job? It could shake things up. We could actually wind up with a decent city council, but my money is it's going to be on the same harebrained city council passing and pushing the same kinds of policies as they are now. And that is not going to do a darn bit of good for the city of Albuquerque.
No, and then the other issue that maybe this starts to touch on a little bit is that, we are a representative democracy from top to bottom in the United States. And there's this seemingly pretty strong advocacy for direct democracy. And I don't know, I'm not sure that's been proven to be any better than the representative form, in a lot of cases worse, because places that have easy ballot initiatives sometimes end up with the worst policies and the most unstable governance, compared to letting a smaller group of represented officials decide policy. So very interesting stuff. But I think we're clearly on the no, but not. It's not the strongest thing we've been against in a long time.
Yeah, well, we'll see how city council shakes out on this one. Like I said, it could be before the voters in early November. Finally, the Rio Grande Foundation did some number crunching this week on the worker employee participation in New Mexico, comparing it with some other states. And we found some interesting tidbits. If you go, and you can find it at arrowsoфenchantment.com, if you go and look through the Bureau of Labor Statistics' workforce participation rates, you can find monthly data going back to January of 1976. Now, we simplified things a little bit. We looked at January data only, going back to 2010. You get a pretty good trend line out of that. Looking at Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and Utah. And workforce participation, folks, is kind of the flip side of unemployment. But unemployment rate is only calculated. You only show up in there if you're actively looking for work and not able to find it. And that's New Mexico is 5.1%, which is a lot lower than we had been for quite some time, but we're still tied for 49th in the country because the national economy is so strong. Alaska is the only state in the union with a worse unemployment rate. We're tied with West Virginia at 5.1%. But that number's kind of stabilized over time. 5.1% is better than we have been, but it's not great. Now, workforce participation, are people in New Mexico by and large involved in the workforce or not? And 2010 is getting back to the days of the Great Recession and the massive economic downturn we had in this country. Comparing us with our neighbors does not bring forth a pretty picture. Most notably, New Mexico has fewer or lower percent workforce participation than it did in 2010. And we are the only state to have not gained workforce participation in the percentage department since 2010 as well. We're down around 55-ish%, whereas the next lowest neighboring state is up over 58%. The highest in the region, Colorado, they managed that despite marijuana legalization. Maybe because of marijuana legalization. That's a whole different discussion, though. 67% workforce participation in Colorado, the land to our north. So you're talking a solid 12 or so percent, really 13, 14% higher participation rate in the workforce in Colorado. That is really blowing us out of the water. So, Wally, I want to give you a chance to comment on this.
Well, the labor participation rate is basically the percentage of people that are employed out of those that are eligible for employment. And so it is just people of working age. Obviously, infants and people in their 90s are not part of the statistic. They're not part of either the numerator or the denominator. The fact that it's so low in New Mexico is of big concern from a policy, a effectiveness of the state point of view. And when you take and you put that with the demographics of the state as well, meaning that we have an older population, we have some challenges there, it really is cause for concern. And I would like to do a little more looking, and I've advocated, although I haven't followed through on the podcast, I do think a demographic look at New Mexico would be something that might be of use to those listening to the podcast in terms of where New Mexico is with our aging population. But anytime you only have just over 50% of those people working who could work, when states around you that are doing the best have, so you're at half, they're at 2/3. That is not a recipe for a successful economy. And New Mexico continues to lag, and I think that one statistic right there could go a long way towards explaining it. Now, the other thing about that statistic is it may be an effect, not a cause. There may be underlying policy issues that we certainly have probably alluded to over the weeks and months that we've been doing the podcast. But yeah, to be that much lower than surrounding states is certainly cause for concern.
No doubt about it. And of course, we know that New Mexico's population is aging. It's aging quite rapidly. As young people they are, we have the data, are leaving New Mexico, and older folks, retirees, are moving in. I'll just hearken back to the United Van Lines report that we discussed a week ago and has been repeated and reported in New Mexico and national media as implying that New Mexico is somehow uniquely attractive to retirees. That is not the case. New Mexico has the highest proportion of people who are moving into New Mexico, according to United Van Lines and their customers. So looking at that universe of any people who are coming to New Mexico, a higher percentage are moving here to retire than any other state. That is a very important nuance. Now, what does it mean? It means that New Mexico is a relatively attractive destination for retirees, but that does not mean that we are overall an attractive destination. In fact, our inbound to outbound was 51.1 to outbound 48.9, according to United Van Lines. So that's the overall number. There are states like Arizona with close to 60% inbound to 40% outbound. And it's notable that United Van Lines also found that the outbound for jobs, people going out of New Mexico, was 54% to inbound of 28%. So people are moving here to retire, but they're moving away from New Mexico for jobs. And I think when we look at this workforce participation rate, the demographics loom large of who is coming here and who is not. New Mexico's always lagged the region, but it's lagging further and further behind. And I think that is the critical thing. I mean, Arizona's got its own share, more than its share of retirees. And I think that's one of the reasons they've lagged the region. A lot more people go to Arizona to retire, apparently, than Colorado. I believe that is the case. I think those Colorado Rocky High mountain snows get a few of those retirees that in Arizona, they're more than happy to deal with that, so they have a lower rate. But New Mexico, we need more people pulling the wagon, less people in the wagon when it comes to the economy, and this workforce participation rate really highlights that issue.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, there's just back to the United Van Lines, it's how statistics can be characterized, and you can look at that and it could be easily characterized, and some have that's, a lot of people are moving to New Mexico because it's a great place to retire. The other way to interpret those statistics is the only reason anybody would ever want to move to New Mexico is to retire. So, it's either one of those is on the extreme. But yes, it's interesting to look a little bit further into the data and see what the ramifications really are.
And I find that is one of the leading activities of the Rio Grande Foundation, is trying to parse through some of these studies that seem to say one thing or are interpreted by the media to say one thing, when in reality they say something very different. And I think, unfortunately, reporters tend to be either uninformed, in a rush, or just don't care and try to put something in that's got a hook, even if it's not factual information and being truly correct and informing your worldview. So unfortunately, this is the way the world works. One last point to make before actually, I'm going to discuss two things. One thing is the polling data that came out this week about the various governors from an outfit called Morning Consult. They did Q1 2019 governor appeal rankings. And I found a couple of things interesting about this. One is, of the top 10 or so governors that they looked at, all the most popular ones are Republicans. Charlie Baker, Republican, Massachusetts. That by itself is a little surprising. Republican of Massachusetts. I know Mitt Romney was there, and they've had their Republican governors. Larry Hogan from Maryland, a potential primary opponent of Donald Trump. I've heard that bandied about, but Maryland's another, state like New Mexico, a blue state with a Republican governor. So two people who have displayed that ability to cross those partisan lines. Chris Sununu of New Hampshire, the free state. These are all the most popular, by the way. Kay Ivey, a Republican of Alabama. Phil Scott, a Republican of Vermont, for Pete's sakes. Bernie Sanders rolling over in his Senate seat. Asa Hutchinson, Arkansas Republican. Greg Abbott, Republican of Texas. Henry McMaster, Republican, South Carolina, North Dakota, Tennessee, Ron DeSantis of Florida. That is all Republicans leading off that most popular. And you're noticing potentially a name that might be relevant here to New Mexico that has not been mentioned yet, and that is because our own Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham is nowhere near the top in the most popular governor category. In fact, the honeymoon, according to this, seems to be rapidly coming to an end for Michelle Lujan Grisham. She is the, seventh least popular governor in the entire USA. Matt Bevin, a Republican from Kentucky, is the most unpopular, least popular. Connecticut, Ned Lamont, a Democrat. Gina Raimondo, a Democrat from Rhode Island. Northam of Virginia. Pritzker of Illinois, of Right to Work banning fame. Oregon, and then Kate Brown of Oregon, and then Michelle Lujan Grisham. So 41 to 33, though. She still has a plurality in terms of popularity. Wally, you think this is a real poll showing that Michelle Lujan Grisham is not as popular as we might have expected, or what do you think's going on here?
Yeah, I was a little surprised to see that her popularity was that low that quickly into her administration when she won by such a large margin. Although there were a lot of things that got a lot of people's attention in terms of things like gun laws. There was basically abortion issues. There's others that there may be a number of basically, I guess, not to coin the term, use the term single issue voters that may have been really turned off by this last session of the legislature over which she presided as governor. So, I'm a little bit surprised, but also governors tend to not be real popular in New Mexico for real long is the modern trend, and maybe she's just accelerating that. I was surprised to hear that a Republican governor of a place like Vermont was popular, but maybe thinking about it, some of those eastern states, they need a Republican governor to rein in their spendthrift and out-of-control legislators. But here in New Mexico, we're all on the same page. We're just going forward with reckless abandon from a policy point of view. And even at that, the governor isn't that popular at this point. So, it bears watching. And I think we'll see what happens after this next legislative session. But I would have thought it would be higher. And I've seen some speculation that maybe this isn't the right poll, that they didn't ask the questions right. And back to your comments about that, certain polls ask questions in certain ways that get results that are not necessarily, without a whole lot of parsing, indicative of the truth.
Yeah, and Steve Terrell of the Santa Fe New Mexican wrote a piece talking about, when she left office, Martinez, her approval number was at 35%, while 49% disapproved. In terms of the Morning Consult poll, Lujan Grisham is at 41% approval with 33% disapproval. That seems, all is well for Lujan Grisham. Of course, she is very early on in her term, and yes, she had a very, very action-packed first legislative session with a lot of game-changing legislation coming out of Santa Fe, most of which she did sign. So perhaps she is losing some of those more centrist-leaning Democrats, and maybe some more Republicans are sticking their necks out and saying, we're not excited about her at all after that session. Maybe they thought she was going to be a moderating voice in Santa Fe, and that did not happen. So we shall see. It's interesting numbers, and we've got 3.5 more years of her to go,
and maybe 7.5.
Maybe 7.5. Yeah. Last thing. Reminder, Dr. Larry Schweikert is speaking on May the 8th. So Wednesday the 8th, be sure to get your seat for that event because tickets prices go from $30 to $40 on Friday, May the 1st. You can order your seat now on riograndefoundation.org to have lunch with Dr. Larry Schweikert, who will be speaking about Ronald Reagan and his new book, Reagan, the American President. We'll be doing a full media tour, although I do not have him scheduled for this podcast. I figure if you're listening to this podcast, you should be the hardest of the hardcore supporters showing up to events like Larry Schweikert just as a reaction. You should have that dialed in on your computer, your phone, or whatever device you use to reserve seats for events for Larry Schweikert and others just right away. And but hopefully you can make it. Wednesday, May 8th, the Marriott Pyramid. Tickets are still $30, but soon to go up to $40 for that. And with that, thanks for listening to this week's discussion. We're working hard every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to riograndefoundation.org for more information or to support our work.